Hey everybody, I'm Catherine Jarmel, and welcome to another edition of Probably Private. And today we're talking about AI privacy again. And I have a plea for us. And my plea for us today is to stop treating PII removal as an answer to privacy for LLMs or really anything else. Okay, why am I so peeved about this? Well, let me tell you a story. About 8 years ago, I trained a deep learning model on one of my big old deep learning machines. Back in the day was quite powerful. And I trained it to find PII in text. That was the only job of this deep learning model. It was really good at it. On many data sets, it got 95, 96%. Based off of regex rules. So how did I build the training data set? Scanned a bunch of text that I had, and some of it being the Enron emails, others being other stuff. And I scanned for and pulled out things like names, email addresses, and it got pretty good. And what did I learn by doing that? Well, I learned memorization happened. I definitely learned that in that exercise, which you can check out a whole series on memorization and deep learning and why that's problematic for privacy and why saving private data that you memorized to remove later in a deep learning model is just as problematic as having that PII sitting in a file. Anyways, that is one of the things that I found. And the other thing I found is, guess what? There was a bunch of other private information in that text that was still sitting there. So I think the first myth that we have to break is that PII actually means privacy. So personally identifiable information, PII, is this term that comes from a US legal context that really has nothing to do with most people's concept of privacy. So PII, what does it mean? It's literally like name, email address, address. And you might say, oh, that sounds like a pretty good start. Yeah, start, not end. Start. And there's so many other ways, especially if we think about language. And if we think about language plus photos, there's so many other ways that I can send you private information where it's not going to show up directly as a name or directly as an email or a phone number or something like this, right? And so PII is not about privacy, right? It's about very specific pieces of information. Yes, do those pieces of information harm somebody's privacy? Absolutely. Are they actually the answer to privacy on any type of systemic scale? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Okay, second off, there's like from a legal perspective, I will want to come back to this. PII is really only relevant for like a very few set of regulations. So you could probably look at HIPAA, which here I'm going to show you a little bit of safe harbor. HIPAA, which by the way is old, crusty, in my opinion, privacy legislation. And so you're going to use HIPAA as like your scale? Are you also using MS SQL on a single server? I mean, I don't really understand. Okay, privacy shade aside, like HIPAA is not a modern piece of privacy legislation. If you have to follow HIPAA, sure, you can do the bare minimum that HIPAA requires. Or you could look at more modern legislation like the GDPR, which, by the way, has literally zero mentions of PII because they got the message. They understand PII, not privacy. Instead, they talk about personal data. Personal data, way bigger than PII. Personal data can be your location, can be your IP address, can be also different things that you put in text that are identifying for you, but are not directly what we might find when we run a PII scanner or PII checker, right? So really, we can take any free input from a user and say, there's some likelihood that contains personal data that we may or may not be able to remove, right? And then we start to broaden and think more clearly. And if I'm, let's say, running analysis and profiling you, if we think about personal data, profiles may fall under personal data, right? And let me just tell you, it's a real thing that a lot of companies will profile you and they will say, this is not your data, it's our data, right? And so these are ways, for example, that we could broaden the definition. And by broadening that definition of privacy, we could A, offer better privacy for everybody, B, actually understand if we're privacy engineers or if we're interested in privacy engineering, what is my job here? What am I trying to protect? What am I trying to do here, right? If you're interested in thinking kind of more deeply about what does privacy in text data mean, and you're willing to read an academic paper, which I guess is a big asterisk there that I have for you, I really, really recommend the Brown et al. Paper on can a language model ever be privacy preserving? And I'll just show you one little snapshot here of one of the examples. And it shows somebody calls a mental health hotline, right? That call is recorded for quality purposes. And that piece of text ends up somewhere. Even if we remove the name, what is the chance that there's a lot of other pieces of information in there that if I know something about the person, I could identify them with? So a linking attack, we call it, or this additional information that I have, right? Was a chance that I could recognize that person by the way they talked, maybe by around the time of the date. Maybe I don't even need an exact date, right? And if I'm that person's boss, and this comes out, maybe I decide they don't need to work here anymore, right? So there's real dangers that exist in text data depending on what's the context and depending on who gets access to that information. And if it's, of course, linkable, right? And so we just have to think a bit harder than simply removing PII, right? Which is fun because this is then a problem that we can really think about and digest. And finally, I think the biggest change that worries me is that we now have LLMs. We have LLMs that have memorized a lot of information about people. And we also have LLMs that can do the agentic workflows, can search the web, can analyze large swaths of text, can analyze from many, many sources, many documents, both online and offline, and perform similarity matches, basically. So here is a little piece of research that recently came out that showed how much easier it is to re-identify someone based on just fairly anonymous text, quote unquote. So what did the researchers do? They took some public text that was available via Anthropic training data sets on interviews. The Anthropic folks said, this is anonymized data. Never say it's anonymized data unless you really, really know it's anonymized. And then the researchers used an LLM with internet access to actually go do things like scrape profiles, compare, build essentially a profile summary based on what was said in the interview, and then use that profile summary to try to find potential candidates online, and then narrow it down based on essentially solver criteria. That, of course, the LLM that they use was powerful, could also write code. So could write a solver problem that says, there's a 80% chance that this is the researcher that they were talking about. Or it's between these two researchers, but I think it's this one, right? Because of these reasons, right? We've now taken a job that would have taken a human many months to do and tedious work. So not exactly the most exciting type of privacy research work is sifting through profiles online and trying to compare and keep, an Excel sheet of criteria, right? And this is, I think, the real privacy danger of LLMs outside of the memorization problems is they make boring security and privacy work, malicious security and privacy work, they make it easy and relatively cheap, and it's only going to become more cheap. And so when we look at something like PII removal and we treat it as like a gold standard, oh, by the way, they think they properly identified 60 to 80% of the researchers. They didn't get final confirmation before the paper was published, but that's a pretty good ratio, right? But I wouldn't want necessarily anonymous texts around any, sensitive topics for me to be found such a way. Nor do I think you want that or most people want that, right? And so when we think about the automation, the scale problem that we introduce with agentic workflows, with LLMs, we make work that used to be tedious and considered expensive, we make it cheaper, right? And we make it cheaper at scale. We can also get it wrong. We can rerun it based on what we learned. We can, write code very quickly that helps us do these things. And for this reason, I think treating PII removal as some sort of gold standard is exceptionally dangerous now. And we should do it, but we should certainly not say, remove PII, all good, let's send this text out in public places. So that's my call for us today. I'd love to hear. I mean, on this channel, obviously, I cover some ways to remove PII because these are some of the, I think, baselines that we need to have. But I'd be curious as to your thoughts on this. Do you treat PII removal in your life as the necessary step? Do you use the PII removal tools we've talked about? And then B, what are your thoughts on this problem that it's so difficult to actually evaluate when a text is safe enough? And I'd love to hear how you think about that. I'll be showing you in coming weeks and months a bit of how I have started reasoning about it with my own AI and LLM use of how do I build the decision matrix in my head of what I do with my data. And I'll also be showing some tips from industry best practices if you're building this at your organization. How do you meet the baseline requirement of removing whatever it is we mean when we say PII? And how do you then go a step further? So if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next week.